On April 8, 2026, a woman sitting in a government office in one of Europe's smallest and poorest capitals picked up a pen and quietly ended 30 years of Russian military occupation. No artillery, no NATO intervention, no sanctions package, just a signature. President Maia Sandu of Moldova signed her country out of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the post-Soviet club Moscow built specifically to keep countries like Moldova politically tethered to the Kremlin long after the USSR collapsed. And with that single legal move, she did something no military force had managed to do in 3 decades. She made 1,500 Russian soldiers illegal. Not surrounded, not under fire, illegal. Their presence on Moldovan soil now constitutes a violation of international law. Their commanders have been personally declared persona non grata. And if any of them try to leave through Moldova, they face immediate arrest and deportation. If they try to leave through Ukraine, which shares a border 2 kilometers from their position, well, Ukraine is currently in an active war with Russia. That route isn't a route, it's a death sentence. So right now, somewhere in a narrow strip of land called Transnistria, squeezed between the Dniester River and Ukraine's border, 1,500 Russian soldiers are sitting in what used to be a forward outpost. And it has quietly become a prison. And the woman who built that prison never fired a single shot. Here's what makes this story so remarkable and why most Western audiences have completely missed it. Moldova is not a country that gets taken seriously. It's the smallest economy in Europe. Population under 3 million. Military budget that most mid-sized cities could match. The country's most famous export is arguably its wine. And even that gets overshadowed by Italy and France at every dinner party. What Moldova just executed was not a military operation. It was a legal strangulation, methodical, precise, and constructed over years. And the Kremlin, which prides itself on chess metaphors, walked directly into it. To understand why this matters beyond Moldova's borders, you have to go back to 1992 and a war most people in the West have completely forgotten. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the chaos left a lot of loose ends across Eastern Europe. Most of them got resolved. One of them didn't. Transnistria is a thin sliver of Moldovan territory on the eastern bank of the Dniester River, bordering Ukraine. It declared independence from Moldova in 1990. Moldova said no. A short war broke out in 1992. Russia's 14th Army intervened on the separatist side. The fighting stopped. And then something peculiar happened. Rather than leaving, the Russian military simply stayed. They rebranded themselves peacekeepers. They inherited a massive Soviet ammunition depot at a village called Kobasna. And for 34 years, they used the combination of troops plus ordnance as a permanent lever against any Moldovan government that showed signs of drifting toward Europe. The playbook was simple and effective. Whenever Chisinau got too close to NATO or the EU, Moscow would signal that things in Transnistria could get complicated. The soldiers weren't really there to fight. There were only about 1,500 of them, which isn't a serious fighting force. They were there as a tripwire, a permanent reminder that Moldova couldn't fully control its own territory. And a country that can't control its own territory can't join the European Union. Then Ukraine changed the calculation completely. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it accidentally did something Moldova's government had been trying to engineer for years. It sealed the eastern supply route to Transnistria. Before 2022, Russia could rotate troops, send supplies, and move personnel through Ukrainian territory into Transnistria. There was a functioning rail corridor. Officers could fly into Ukraine and drive across the border. The operational group of Russian forces, the official name for those 1,500 soldiers, could be maintained, resupplied, and rotated on a reasonably functional basis. After February 2022, Ukraine was at war with Russia. That corridor closed. Moldova simultaneously started refusing rotation attempts at its own border. So the supply lines to Transnistria, which ran through 2 countries that both now had excellent reason to block Russian military movement, simply stopped working. The core officers, around 70 to 100 actual Russian military personnel, the rest being Transnistrian locals who'd been issued Russian passports, found themselves stuck. Rotation attempts since 2022 have been consistently blocked. A Ukrainian defense official confirmed in April 2026 that reinforcing the Transnistrian contingent is now physically impossible. What this means practically: no new ammunition, no fuel resupply through official channels, no fresh personnel, and no ability to execute any significant military operation, even if someone in Moscow ordered one. The Kremlin still has soldiers in Transnistria. It just can't do anything useful with them. That was the position when Sandu picked up her pen in April. Since 2022, Moldova had already denounced 71 of the 283 agreements it held within the CIS framework. 60 more were in the process of being scrapped at the time of the final vote. By the time Parliament voted 60-41 on April 2nd to complete the withdrawal, the institutional architecture was already largely dismantled. The April 8th signature by Sandu was the last piece snapping into place. What it accomplished legally is significant. Russia's justification for stationing troops in Transnistria had always rested partly on CIS peacekeeping arrangements. With Moldova no longer a CIS member, that institutional cover has become legally untenable. The Moldovan government's own February 2026 non-paper to Brussels framed the Russian military presence as illegal and its withdrawal as non-negotiable, language that was deliberate and precisely timed to coincide with EU accession negotiations. Then Chisinau went further. The command echelon of the operational group of Russian forces in Transnistria, including the commander and his senior deputies, was declared persona non grata on Moldovan territory. Commander Dmitry Zelenkov and his top officers are now in a peculiar position. If they attempt to leave Transnistria through Moldova, they face immediate detention and deportation. If they try to exit through Ukraine, the outcome requires no elaboration. The command structure of a Russian military unit is now physically locked inside a strip of land roughly 200 kilometers long and 15 kilometers wide. Sergei Shoigu, now Russia's Security Council secretary, previously its defense minister for a decade, responded by announcing Russia would use all available methods to protect its personnel, which sounds menacing until you ask the obvious follow-up question: what methods exactly? Ukraine is in the way. Moldova is a NATO candidate and EU accession frontrunner. The logistics don't exist. The threat is a sentence without a verb. Now here's the part that keeps European security officials genuinely awake at night, and it has nothing to do with troop movements. Underneath those 1,500 soldiers sitting in warehouses in the village of Kobasna is the largest illegal ammunition depot in Eastern Europe. 20,000 tons of Soviet-era weapons, artillery shells, tank rounds, rockets, small arms ammunition. All of it accumulated during the Cold War as the 14th Soviet Army withdrew from East Germany and Czechoslovakia and needed somewhere to put everything it was carrying. Kobasna became the dumping ground for the Warsaw Pact's Western European arsenal. 20,000 tons of ammunition that hasn't been properly inspected since 2007. And a significant percentage of it is degraded. Estimates suggest around 57% has exceeded its safe shelf life. The Academy of Sciences of Moldova concluded that a full detonation event at Kobasna could be equivalent to the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 10 kilotons. Other estimates compare it to the 2020 Beirut port explosion, multiplied several times over. Either way, the blast radius would extend 40 to 50 kilometers, crossing into Ukraine and covering a substantial portion of northern Moldova. International inspectors from the OSCE have been denied access since 2004. Only Russian and Transnistrian authorities know the actual current condition of the stockpile. Nobody outside that closed circle knows what's stable, what's degrading, and what might require only a stray spark. The dark irony is that those soldiers have now become the depot's prisoners. The ammunition can't be safely transported, much of it is too degraded, and the soldiers can't leave. So 20,000 tons of deteriorating Cold War ordnance sits in a village 2 kilometers from Ukraine's border, guarded by a garrison that has no exit, no resupply, and no clear future. There's also a less discussed dimension. Security analysts and intelligence services have for years suspected Kobasna of being a source of black market arms flows into conflict zones across Europe and Africa. When you have an uninspected, unaccountable arsenal in a region with no functioning state authority, that arsenal tends to develop commercial applications. How much of those original 20,000 tons actually remains is a question nobody outside Tiraspol and Moscow can answer with confidence. The military isolation is only half the picture. What's happening to Transnistria's economy is the other half, and in some ways, it's more decisive. Transnistria ran on Russian gas. For years, Moscow supplied the region with free or heavily subsidized natural gas, which the separatist government then used to generate cheap electricity, selling a portion to Moldova itself, which created the bizarre situation of the victim subsidizing its own occupation through energy bills. The Kukyurgan power plant was Transnistria's primary cash generator. In January 2025, Ukraine stopped allowing Russian gas transit through its pipeline network. The gas stopped flowing. Transnistria's energy economy collapsed almost immediately. The Kukyurgan plant switched to coal, which is expensive and available in limited quantities. Electricity prices inside Transnistria spiked. The regional budget, already dependent on Russian transfers, came under severe strain. The population response has been straightforward: leave. Young people, educated people, anyone with marketable skills has been exiting Transnistria toward Moldova proper and then into the EU. What remains is an aging population, a contracting economy, and a separatist administration in Tiraspol that increasingly resembles a company that's been disconnected from its power source and is still trying to process invoices. Meanwhile, Moldova, with substantial EU support, Brussels has committed billions in financial and structural assistance, has been modernizing its energy grid, integrating into European electricity networks, and systematically eliminating the leverage points Russia built over decades. By 2026, the toolkit Moscow used to own Moldova was empty. One of the most creative geopolitical maneuvers in this entire story is how Moldova plans to join the European Union, despite having an unresolved separatist region on its own territory. Normally, Russia's playbook for blocking EU and NATO integration has been simple: create a frozen conflict inside the target country, then insist the conflict must be resolved before integration can proceed. It worked in Georgia with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It worked for years in Ukraine with Donbass. The logic is circular by design. Russia creates the obstacle, then points to the obstacle as the reason integration is impossible. Moldova cracked this logic open with a two-stage accession strategy. Chisinau is pursuing EU membership based on the territory under central government control, the right bank of the Dniester, without waiting for Transnistria to be resolved. The February 2026 non-paper to Brussels proposes applying EU law across the rest of Moldova while suspending it in Transnistria for a transition period, effectively bypassing Russia's veto mechanism entirely. Moldova has publicly set a target of completing accession negotiations by 2028. Brussels has been receptive. The EU is increasingly treating Transnistria not as a frozen conflict problem, but as a European security issue, and the framing has shifted from "Moldova must solve this first" to Transnistria's resolution is part of accession rather than a prerequisite for it. That framing shift is enormous. It means Russia's standard blocking mechanism no longer applies. And then there's the scenario that makes Russian strategists genuinely lose sleep. Not because it's imminent, it isn't, but because it's no longer obviously impossible. In January 2026, Maia Sandu sat down with a British political podcast called The Rest is Politics. The hosts, fully expecting a diplomatic non-answer, asked whether she supported unification with Romania. Sandu looked at them and said, "If we have a referendum, I will vote for unification with Romania." The podcast host spent the final minutes of the interview audibly processing what had just happened. Former British Minister Rory Stewart noted that heads of state almost never suggest their own country should be absorbed into a neighbor. It's not the kind of thing that happens. Sandu wasn't being reckless. She was being strategic. The statement was a calculated signal directed simultaneously at Bucharest, Brussels, and Moscow. The message: if EU integration stalls because of Hungarian vetoes or Russian obstruction, Moldova has a Plan B. And Plan B involves Romania, which is already a full NATO member and EU member state. The arithmetic of what unification would mean for Russia's position is staggering. A unified Romanian-Moldovan state would be a NATO member state on day one. Every square kilometer of former Moldovan territories, including the perimeter around Transnistria, would fall under NATO's collective defense guarantee. Those 1,500 Russian soldiers in Transnistria, already isolated and unable to resupply, would wake up one morning inside NATO territory, not facing Moldova's small army, facing the Atlantic Alliance. A March 2026 poll found 44% of Moldovans living inside the country support unification, with 60% of Moldovans living abroad in favor. These numbers represent a significant shift from a decade ago. Lavrov has called the prospect a plan to destroy Moldovan statehood, which is a sentence that reads very differently depending on whether you're in Moscow or Chisinau. You don't play a card like that unless you believe the hand you're holding. A country of 3 million people, with an economy smaller than many European cities, spent years building a trap out of paperwork, energy infrastructure, and legal architecture. And on April 8th, she closed it. No artillery required. Moldova didn't defeat Russia militarily. It made Russia's military position in Transnistria absurd, politically, legally, logistically, and economically, until the only thing left was the physical fact of soldiers standing in warehouses they can't leave, next to ammunition they can't move, in a region whose population is quietly emigrating toward the EU. And Maia Sandu did it while simultaneously chairing the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers, pursuing EU accession, and telling British podcast hosts she'd vote to join Romania if given the chance. Putin has spent 20 years telling the world that small countries near Russia's borders should know their place. Moldova just showed exactly what knowing your place actually looks like. If this breakdown gave you a different view of what modern geopolitical warfare actually looks like, subscribe, because next we're going into a country that's been quietly building one of the most unusual military postures in the world. And once you see how they did it, you won't look at the map the same way again. Stay sharp.